We are in Psalm 32 today, looking at the psalm, this great psalm. We're in this psalm most of the week, and we're looking at the joy of forgiveness. And we're returning back to the psalm. We've already done the first 4 verses, so we're going to turn today actually back to verse 3 again, because we're looking at some of the way this psalm is progressing. And in verse 3 he says, "When I kept silent about my sin, my body wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me, and my vitality was drained away as with the fever heat of summer." So we look at verses 3 and 4, and what we're looking at here is David is backing up. He's already confessed his sin. He's already saying how blessed he is to be forgiven of his sin. But now he's looking at what life was like for him before he confessed his sin and received God's forgiveness. And he's describing in verses 3 and 4 really the physical and emotional consequences of living in sin. The child of God who is underneath that burden of sin is going to suffer consequences. They try to put it off. Many times we try to skirt it. We try to excuse our lifestyle and our sinfulness. But there's a price to pay. And not just on a spiritual level, which is certainly there, and he'll talk about that, but also on the physical level. There's a price. In verse 3, when I kept silent about my sin, my body wasted away. There was a physical consequence that he suffered. Perhaps he had stomach problems or headaches or nervousness, or he couldn't sleep or whatever it was, but there was a definite physical element to what he was suffering. And then he had a mental one as well, when he says, through my groaning all day long. So he, for whatever reason at that point, was not turning back to confess his sin to the Lord. He was trying to somehow cover it up or whatever. But in his conscience, in his mind, in his heart, he knew better. And so he was not a happy camper. He was moaning, he was groaning all day long because the consequences of sin weighed on him, as it does on all of us. Then there's the spiritual. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. Now again, he's looking back. He's now come to the Lord for forgiveness, but he's looking back and realizing that the Lord simply didn't look the other way while he was living in sin. That the Lord's hand was on him heavily. The Lord was dealing with him in ways that now he recognizes. Earlier, he might have excused it for just a grumpy day or bad weather or whatever. But now he sees that the Lord himself is involved and his hand is heavy on him. And then there's an emotional element as well. Through my groaning all day long, he says. And then at the end of verse 4, my vitality was drained away as with the fever heat of summer. He had no energy. He didn't have any get up and go. He just was drained because of his sin. So no matter what other things might have been going well for David at this time, his life internally was a mess because there was sin in his life that he did not want to deal with. Then he turns in verse 5 to confession. This is when he begins to acknowledge his sinfulness. I acknowledge my sin to you, and my iniquity I did not hide. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. So finally he gets around to realizing all this burden on him is too heavy to bear. It's time to deal with it, and finally he does. And as he does so, he finds the forgiveness from his guilt. His guilt is gone because the Lord has forgiven him as he acknowledged his sin or confessed his sin. Now in verse 6, he turns to others, and he is encouraging and recommending that other people follow this same line that he's done. He wants to broadcast the joy of forgiveness. In verse 6, therefore let everyone who is godly pray to you in time when you may be found. Surely in a flood of great waters they will not reach him. What he's saying in verse 5 and 6, or verse 6 in particular, is confusing to many people. He calls on them to actually do what he's done, confess their sins, receive God's forgiveness. But do it, he says, when the Lord may be found. In the flood of many waters, we may not reach him. Now, what he means by that is this. Anytime we truly reach out to the Lord in confession and repentance, he will forgive us. The scriptures are clear on that. But in the midst of the battle, in the heat of the battle, When the flood waters of the consequences of our sin are pouring down on us, there are times when perhaps it doesn't seem the Lord is reachable. And perhaps the Lord is not going to allow us simply to be glib about this because we're not sincere. And so we don't reach out and we don't find him at those times. And so he says, what he's basically saying is this: as soon as you recognize sin in your life, don't just put it off and say, I'll deal with it tomorrow, I'll deal with it some other time. Go right to the Lord now, right now. Today is the day of going to him and confessing that sin and receiving his forgiveness. So David has been through this, and he is instructing others to do what he's done and not put off going to the Lord for confession of sin. And these words have been written thousands of years ago, still coming down to us and still saying the exact same thing. If there's sin in your life that you're aware of, go to the Lord now and have his forgiveness. What a joy there is in that kind of forgiveness from the Lord.